So Modern Money Mechanics, written by the Federal Reserve, makes it very clear for, not only is debt created through such loans, a multiplier is used which allows more money to be created for loans than exist in deposits. This means it is increasingly creating debt, pyramiding by all accord. There's actually a 1941 testimony, I can't remember his name, of prior head of the Federal Reserve. When he's asked about this process, he said, if there was no debts in our money system, there would be no money. If there was no money, there'd be no debt. If there was no debt, there's no money. So this is admitted by the head of the Federal Reserve years ago. Now, as far as the notion that the Federal Reserve creates its net earnings to, as far as the notion that the Federal Reserve rebates its net earnings to the Treasury every year, the mathematical point is utterly lost as far as the point that's being made in the film. If you loan $100 at 10% interest, you have to return $110 to me. Well, where does that extra $10 come from if money can only be created through the Fed or a commercial bank which uses the same interest-based loan practices? Even though the Fed returns some of the interest to the Treasury, that interest is still being pulled from the money supply itself. And the money supply does not have the interest fee included. It is only the principal. It doesn't matter how much debt the Fed itself holds in the long run. It is the method that the Fed incorporates into its monetary policy which is the problem. And this has been overly admitted by so many different people, and I just amazed the debunkers continue to make things up in regards to this. They just mince words and redefine things semantically, and they can paint these pictures that the definitions are different than what I'm describing. It's very frustrating, but I hope everyone understands this. It's extremely simple, and it should be utterly well known. And again, admitted by the people in the Federal Reserve itself. Point 3. Now here, this is really quick. There was a dispute of Thomas Jefferson's position on the banks historically and paper money. Some claims that said Jefferson was in favor or not dead wrong, so let me quickly point out Jefferson's position. Thomas Jefferson stated in a letter to John Taylor in 1816, quote, "And I sincerely believe with you that banking establishments are more dangerous than standing armies, and that the principle of spending money to be paid by posterity under the name of funding is but swindling futurity on a large scale." That was a letter from Thomas Jefferson to John Taylor, Monticello, May 1816. You can find that. In another comment Jefferson made to John Wayne's Eepes, it also says, quote, "Bank paper must be suppressed, and the circulating medium must be restored to the nation to whom it belongs," referring to the central banking system. This is documented in Thomas Jefferson to John Wayne Eepes, Monticello. I believe it's the same book that has both of those quotes. So that should be very obvious about his position. In Zeitgeist, it states that by the early 20th century, the U.S. had already implemented and removed a few central banking systems which were swindled into place by ruthless banking interests. This particular quote, which is alluding to the earlier banking systems, has been jumped all over by debunkers, and considered it's just one sentence. They've gone crazy to denote all sorts of interesting things. For example, they say that the preceding central banks, they basically toe the party line, that the banks were there for stability, and they helped America. One side even said that Jefferson was passive on the issue when these were coming, and I've already talked about that prior. So there's a lot of issues that need to be talked about with this, and we're going to go straight down the line from the beginning. There were 2 central banking systems implemented after the U.S. Constitution was created, before the Federal Reserve created. There was actually one way earlier, but we're not going to talk about that one because that was before the Constitution. It was the First Bank of the United States and the Second Bank of the United States. Those are the 2 banks that existed before the Federal Reserve. The first issue to consider is, what is the reasoning for the banks in the eyes of Congress? This is something that isn't talked about very often. The essential reason that banks were created was because of the limitations imposed by the Constitution when it comes to money creation. The Constitution, Article 1, Section 8 and 10 states, "Congress shall have the power to borrow money, coin money, and regulate the value thereof, and fix the standard of weight and measures, and provide for the punishment of counterfeiting. No state shall coin money, emit bills of credit, or anything but gold and silver coin a tender in payments of debts." So the Constitution makes it very clear that money must be coined and not printed, not emit bills of credit. For clarification on this, let's refer to Thomas Cooley's well-regarded Principles of Constitutional Law. It explains that, quote, to coin money is to stamp piece of metal for use as a medium of exchange, period. The Constitution prohibited emitting bills of credit. In other words, the printing of money not backed by gold or silver. Now, in fact, for those who have semantic issues with these terms, the wording of the section of the Constitution that we're describing here can be traced back to the original Articles of Confederation, where it says, the United States and Congress assembled shall have the sole and exclusive right and power of regulating the alloy and value of coin struck by their own authority or by that of the respective states, fixing the standard weights and measures throughout the United States. So, Congress could not just print money. It had to be coined. However, the Constitution does say Congress could borrow it. So what they did was a simple sanction of a U.S. central bank, give the bank the power to create the money and thus lend the money to the government. In turn, they made sure that the fiat IOUs were accepted as money by the public. This was done to bypass the constitutional restrictions. It's a collusion, in fact, of ignorant, malicious congressmen. Malicious is a rough word. Just greedy congressmen that wanted to do things but knew they had restrictions, and they colluded with bankers to do it. Alexander Hamilton submitted the proposal in 1790 and was deeply opposed, of course, by Thomas Jefferson, who was then Secretary of State. Jefferson also pointed out that the Constitution did not grant to Congress the power to create a bank or anything of the sort. You can't delegate that type of authority. You have to have an amendment to do so. Jefferson stated, quote, a private central bank issuing the public currency is a greater menace to the liberties of the people than a standing army. This can be sourced in actually a lot of letters. He used the standing army metaphor in many letters, but this particular one is coming from the quote, the writings of Thomas Jefferson, put out by Putnam and Sons, 1899. Now, that being denoted, while some positives are noted from the first Bank of the United States, such as the taming of the wildcat banks, meaning those banks that were independent in the states and they were doing lots of fraudulent things, because there was fraud throughout. I mean, the very nature of banking is fraudulent by its very accords. You can only expect, regardless of whether it's a central bank or a small bank, fraud will be commenced. It's inherently fraudulent, but that's for a different point. The taming of the wildcat banks, they helped tame those issues by refusing to accept notes from those banks. It's because they tracked their reputation, weeding out the more corrupt ones. But it also did something else. It created tremendous inflation. Central banks always create tremendous inflation, especially it's obvious to mark when they're first put into position, especially the first and second, because as mentioned earlier, Congress wants to make more money. So what they do is they give themselves a machine to do so, bypassing the gold standards and the coin standards that have been put forward in the Constitution. So, in the first 5 years of the first bank, 42% of the people's savings were confiscated through the hidden tax known as inflation. And that's a tremendous amount of money. Inflation is always inherent. And if you don't understand how inflation is a hidden tax on the public, look that up. It's a very fascinating thing to understand. It's something that Ron Paul understands very well. It's something that many people in this country are going to be experiencing very soon as the collapse of the financial system continues. So in 1811, the charter was not renewed after much debate. In a letter to John Adams in 1814, Thomas Jefferson made his position very clear once again. He says, quote, I have ever been the enemy of the banks, not of those discounting for cash, but of those fostering their own paper into circulation and thus banishing our cash. My zeal against those institutions was so warm and open at the establishment of the first Bank of the United States that I was derided as a maniac by the tribe of bank mongers who were seeking to filch from the public their swindling and barren gains. I think you couldn't say anything better than that. And that was from the Adams-Jefferson letters, which were published later in 1971. At least that's the publishing date. That's noted on the source I have, Volume 2, page 424.